Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Stanishi. Welcome to Open Forum, candid, frank, and live, of course. Welcome to the Spanglish World Network on Zingo TV, channel 250. Please remember to download the Zingo TV app at the respective app stores for iOS and Android devices. While you download, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are absolutely free. Zingo TV is available on Google, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Fire TV sticks, Roku sticks, and, of course, 2016 smart TVs forward. Now on Open Forum, joining me is Dr. Mock, Karen Rochelle Mock. May I call you Dr. Mock?
You can call me Karen.
Okay, well, I'm okay with calling you Karen as well. Mind you, though, as you know, today being called a Karen could be almost a problem,
Oh.
right? I'm sure you're not one of those Karens. Okay. That kind of brings us to really what you're all about. You're all about human rights. You've spent a lifetime learning about it, not only learning, but being educated to the limit that almost any person has been. You've used it and facilitated that ability to head one of the things that I find very interesting. That's J Space. Human rights today, I think, more than any other time, has been. We're more aware of it, because I guess because of the information society that we live in and how we're so almost informed about. We've gone sort of past the tipping point of understanding that racism and human rights are being, there's atrocities everywhere. To now, we're getting to the point where we're really not sure if some of the atrocities are true, or information, misinformation, all that kind of stuff. First of all, let's talk about what got you to where you were and decided to work in human rights.
Well, where do we start? We can start in terms of my own background. I grew up in downtown Toronto, was born just at the end of the Second World War. And downtown Toronto, I guess at the time, was as close as you could be to being raised in what we learned to call a multicultural society. My grandparents had come just before and just after the First World War, but the entire rest of the family that they left was lost in the Holocaust. And where I was raised, there was a fair-sized Jewish community downtown on Markham Street in those days. But at the same time, we had a very, as I say, multicultural group. A huge influence on my life in terms of human rights was being part of the B'nai B'rith youth organization as a teenager, and being a teenager in the civil rights movement, and learning through what we then called the Anti-Defamation League, but which became the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith eventually, learning about what we learned to call diversity later on, but we called it sisterhood, brotherhood, equality rights, learning not to turn a blind eye when there was poverty or when there was racism. I must say, at the same time, I also grew up in the celebration that Israel had become a state, and that this whole notion of the UN and self-determination for all peoples was all part of how I was raised. I became an educational psychologist, teaching teachers, child development, learning theory, but because of my own background, always including in that work what it meant to be a newcomer, to learn English as a second language. What about families? What about diversity in cultures? How does the curriculum have to meet the needs? In fact, I'm old enough, they call me a pioneer. I founded the first course in Canada in multicultural teacher education, which we then were able to call multicultural anti-racist education. We couldn't use the R word in those days. But regretfully, by the late 80s, mid to late 80s, I began to experience a rise of antisemitism in the actual anti-racism movement. And so when the ad came across from the Canadian Jewish News that the League for Human Rights of B'nai B'rith was looking for someone who wanted to fight anti-Semitism and at the same time knew multiculturalism and anti-racism and community relations, that looked like the job that was tailor-made for me. And so I went full-time into human rights work in the late 80s. My goal at that time was to do what I did within the Jewish community, continue to do the work in diversity and multiculturalism. I was president of the Ontario Multicultural Association at the time, and we helped found the Equity Summit Group, which was the school board personnel that were trying to do this work. And sadly, it comes and it goes. Human rights, as you say, has become part of our culture. I saw the history of it unfold. I saw us pass the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 82. I saw in 1988 when multiculturalism became enshrined in law, the policy that Pierre Elliott Trudeau announced in 71 on the floor of the House of Commons, that we lived in a multicultural society and a bilingual framework, was now enshrined in law. And eventually I became head of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation. And at that time, for those years when we countered the hate and the hate crimes and the hate groups, we managed to see that anti-Semitism was included on the anti-racist agenda. Regretfully, today, because this is a political football, and when we see the rise in the United States of Trump's kind of thinking with the rise in racism, the rise in anti-Semitism, we see that spilling over into Canada. And for me, because of human rights has become the standard, there are too many people who recognize human rights violations for their own people, but not when they are part of the problem against others. And so we see, because there are those who can only see it when it's against their own people, the anti-Semitism has risen again in the anti-racism and anti-oppression world, some of it disguised as anti-Zionism. Now, I'm not one to say that those who criticize the policies of the government of Israel are anti-Semitic. You just have to go to Israel and live in Israel to see that, Jews are the most vocal critics of the government there and the policies. However, the time has come again for us to name racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and right-wing extremism and hate crime in all of its forms, so that everybody has human rights, safety, and security. That's where I come from, and my life's work has been, how do you put theory and policy into practice?
And I have to tell you that it's a lot. There's a lot to unpack in regards to what your motives and your goals are. I'm a firm believer that the biggest problem with racism and discrimination is that I think it gets too specific. I'm asking you a question, and this is the way I'm framing it. The real root of getting away from racism, for me, is just two words: mutual respect. Because you referred to the fact that sometimes some people, without realizing, are racist, and while they're complaining about being discriminated against, they actually do the same thing. I just think that we're lacking mutual respect, and I don't mean just by races. I just mean from one person to the next.
Well, you've really hit something there. They used to say what we have to do is have tolerance for everyone. And in Canada, we say, no. We have to go beyond tolerance to respect and to acceptance, that you can tolerate a toothache, but you want to get rid of it, right? So no, this is not about, we want to fight intolerance. But what does mutual respect really mean? To
Yeah,
me,
you asking me?
yeah,
Or are
I
you gonna
am. Well,
sure,
no, it's a
sure.
rhetorical question.
Yeah, okay,
It's a
then carry on.
rhetorical question because if I respect you, it means I also respect and try to understand what hurts you. And many people say, well, I don't hate Jews. I respect Jews, or, well, I respect Blacks, but
I
Or
have black
I
friends.
respect Muslims, but, and there's always that but. So what does it mean? In human rights work and in the norms of anti-racism, anti-oppression work, there is a norm that victim groups can define their own oppression and say how they feel about it. And the job of the listener or the person who respects them isn't to say, oh, but that's not true. That's not racist. It's to say, help me understand why it is you feel that way. Or you've said that that is anti Semitic. I need to understand more about that from your point of view. So that's, we have to stretch respect and we have to say it means listening, it means understanding, it means empathetic communication. It doesn't mean, and it means, yes, I respect your freedom and I respect your dignity, but your freedom ends at my nose, at the violence, or your freedom of speech ends at your saying something anti Semitic or hateful or anti Black or anti Muslim. In Canada, we have something called hate speech, and we have laws that are to protect people. Sadly, we have people thinking that their freedom means that they can do whatever they damn well please. And that is not freedom. That doesn't have mutual respect and acceptance and dignity and security and safety for everyone.
My definition of mutual respect, and I'm sorry for jumping in too soon. My definition of mutual respect is it's very simple. It's that I depend and require and need the respect from you that I expect from myself and that you have a right to expect from me. So we should both come to the table with basically the lowest part of the bar where respect matters, and be willing to both get to that point and then raise the bar of the relationship moving forward. I'm not a big fan of the word tolerance because tolerance implies there's something wrong with somebody.
Yeah.
And I think that's totally wrong, and it shouldn't be a part of the conversation. Tolerance is something you say to racists to calm them down. That's it's not something that you for like I read a little bit about you, and I understand that generationally speaking, the Jewish experience began thousands of years ago. Then, and I'm going to shortcut it just to try to make a point so I can ask you a question. So, in World War II, we had the Holocaust. I understand some people don't prescribe to that notion, which it's true. Facts show that it's true. So now you have a generation that comes to America, and then you have your generation, and now you have you've retired from J space because you feel another generation should come. The point I'm trying to make is our tolerance is no longer necessary now. I think we can go to mutual respect because my parents, your parents brought us here. We can take the next step. There's a progression, and you mentioned how more and more young Jewish kids are more tolerant of Palestinians than the previous generation. I just wonder why you say that.
Well, because I think that the new generations are more aware and have been taught about what it means to respect other people. And for example, with the United Nations commitment to self-determination for all peoples, they would say Palestinians who identify ethnically as Palestinians have a right to self-determination and a state of their own, as do Jews as a nation, as a people, and to be recognized as a people. So if we are to have equity and we're to have security and dignity and respect for all, then Jewish people have to have the right to self-determination. And for me, that is what Zionism was about having a state where they didn't have to fear that eventually they would be expelled or excluded or murdered. And similarly, all peoples who identify are entitled to that same kind of respect. Now, when people go too far and say, my people deserve that, but your people don't. Now, you talked about coming here. Well, we came here and we understand what it means when there are indigenous people whose lands were taken over and who ended up oppressed. And we have said now we've got to make sure that everyone has dignity and respect and that there's redress and that we acknowledge that we are on indigenous lands. Well, similarly, what is the argument? There's no point in people trying to deny other people's indigenous rights. How long is long enough? I mean, if Jews are indigenous, and we all know they were historically, biblically, and so on, but it was a small tribe. Well, with our indigenous tribes in Canada, there might have been a small tribe, but they have just as much right to live in dignity and respect in Canada as the larger tribes that surrounded them. So what the research is showing, there's been outstanding demographic research done by, Professor Brim, for example, came and did a talk at one of the J-Space Canada conferences, that the newer generations of Jewish activists, many of whom were raised in the day schools, the Jewish day
Yep.
schools, and were active in Hillel and so on, they don't see a disconnect between being able to be pro-Israel, pro-Palestine, and pro-peace. So when, God forbid, someone should say, oh, I'm tired of hearing about slavery. If they said that to Black people, they would be accused of racism. Well, when Jews hear, I'm sick and tired of hearing about the Holocaust, that was many years ago, that is anti-Semitic. And so it doesn't help when Jewish people say, oh, there's no such thing as Islamophobia, it should only be called Muslim hatred. Well, that's just as bad as people saying anti-Semitism comes in lots of forms. It's not just Jew hatred. So when someone says, oh, I don't hate Jews, but I don't think they should have a right to this, that, and the other thing, then that's anti-Semitic. So we can use the A word and define anti-Semitism when Jewish state is the only state that's singled out for human rights violations, or when the graduation exercises are held on a Friday night. That would be a systemic anti-Semitic, in the same as there's systemic racism when a group is singled out, or when Asian people are singled out wrongly for spreading viruses. How is it then that can be called anti-Asian racism? And then when Jews are accused of domination, or the modern day libels of poisoning the wells or causing the plague, that is anti-Semitism. And we need to use those words, and we need to allow Jewish people to define how they feel. When anti-Semitism is defined, it doesn't silence freedom of speech. It opens up the conversation so that with mutual respect, people can talk about how they're feeling and why something is or isn't anti-Semitic.
Yeah, they're two Dr. Mock, they're two of my favorite words: mutual respect. Um, and in case people get the impression, I want the folks out there to understand, you have a lot of sympathy, and so does your group. J Space has a lot of sympathy for the travails of the Palestinians, in Israel, who are losing their homes. You're not just you're practicing what you preach, and there are a lot of Jews in Israel that support maybe less or none or whatever. Please define it for us. What in your mind is happening to Palestinians that the Jewish state shouldn't be doing right now?
Well, you summed it up. Should they be having different rules for Jews and Palestinians in a democratic state? Should there be systemic lack of employment for one group or another? Or in a state like Canada, that is democratic and like Israel that is democratic, should they have programs of employment equity and so on? Yes. And guess what? In Israel, they do have those kinds of programs. So labeling Israel an apartheid state because you don't define apartheid as only the South African kind of apartheid isn't helpful, because it's not in the sense that people understand it. That would be a vilification. We want freedom and dignity and respect and human rights and security for Palestinians. We also want freedom and dignity and human rights and security and safety for Jews in the region, and self-determination for Jews in the region. We don't want the group with more power to be allowing some people to build additions to their homes and not other people. We don't want there to be exclusion. You also used another word when you said your favorite words are mutual respect. You used some other words. You talked about relationships and building relationships. There are so many amazing programs in Israel that are building shared society, that are saying Arabs are 20% of the population, and they deserve, as a recognized minority, to have human and civil rights, and build the relationships so that Jews and Arabs don't grow up hating each other because of the stereotypes or because they don't know each other. Now, having said that, we know one of the lessons of the Holocaust is people who were rescuers and who saved Jews from being murdered. It wasn't necessarily because they knew the people or because they had a relationship with the people. Solid psychological research on who the rescuers were found that it wasn't those other factors. The main factors were that they had role models who taught them the difference between good and evil and the difference between right and wrong. And they didn't follow the propaganda or the lies. Today in the United States and in Canada, we see hate propaganda of the type that Goebbels taught the world. Repeat the lies often enough about Jews, about Muslims, about immigrants, about government, about you name it, about health, then
About the other party.
people will believe the lies. And so I look to education. We once wrote a manual for B'nai B'rith called Taking Action Against Hate, Protection, Prevention, and Partnerships. And the protection meant we needed the protection of the law, the human rights law, the police, the legislation, the policies in agencies and school board, and how you can be protected. But we also needed education. That's the prevention. We needed, from the very early childhood level onward, education against racism, education for human rights, education about Blacks in an all-white neighborhood, education about Jewish people, Holocaust education, you name it, education. But also, and we needed, by the way, teacher education on how to do all of that. We also needed partnerships, dialogue programs, partnerships, parents working with teachers, teachers working with police, police working with people, partnerships, and intercultural and interfaith and multiracial partnerships. Good people, they say that evil happens when good people do nothing.
Exactly.
And so we have to put the words into action. We have to say, we live in this country, we want human rights, peace, freedom, and dignity for everyone, not just for people in power. And we feel the same way about Israel and Palestine. We need safety and security. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden everybody just lays down arms and the Jews say that's fine, because history has taught us that eventually, if that is the case, whether it's demographics or whatever else, Jews will be discriminated. They call it the longest hatred. So it doesn't mean just cease. It means make sure that the infrastructure is such that everyone has security and safety, and it needs to be negotiated by them. It's not up to us, but it's got to be the commitment for the mutual self respect and equality and equity before the law.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Dr. Mock, it seems to me as a viewer, a purveyor of society, that hate is profitable. That's what I'm learning in my little bit of old age, is that hate can be very profitable. Uh, uh, to negate that and to try and make that not work, we really do have to. The art of actively listening is very important, and sometimes actively listening may be a function, but it has to be something that lands. It's like having a microphone, but not having it connected to anything. You have to actively listen. And we're living in a world today where not listening is the way that people move forward. It's become such a terrible thing. When you talk about anti-Semitism, when you talk about human rights, um, for me, if we can talk about human rights from what you've learned and what you've shared with people, I'll start with this by saying, for me, human rights is every child that's born should be born without fear, have enough food, and a roof over the head. That to me is the basic principle that I live by. How do we progress from there?
That's right. I mean, Maslow taught us years ago that there's a hierarchy of needs. And if people don't have the basics, if they don't have food, if they don't have safety, if they don't have security, they cannot develop to become fully fledged human beings and reach their potential. So, of course, again, we have to practice what we preach. And the humanitarian disasters in the world must be dealt with. This is why I get upset when people say, oh, we should be not funding this and not funding that for humanitarian aid. That's not going to bring peace, is if humanitarian aid is not given. We do need to make sure that that humanitarian aid is not being used for weapons and terrorism. And so any of that has to be monitored. But you're absolutely right. Every child deserves to be born into a situation where their basic needs are met and where they in fact can thrive and be the best they can be. And they don't have that when they are raised as second class citizens or with inferiority complexes or in fear or with hatred. The other thing is that you hit on when you talked about hate seems to be profitable is the media. I mean, I'm glad you're doing this and that you've got a channel to raise these kinds of issues, but we also do need the media to be more part of the solution and not the problem. They say if it bleeds, it leads. So violence and terrorism and hate tend to be much more newsworthy than love. I mean, when I do the Arab Jewish dialogue, or when we know that there's going to be Arabs and Jews together in a program talking about how do you build relationships, ho hum, you can send out the press release and nobody comes to cover that. But if we were to say that this Arab and this Jew were now going to fight it out and scream and yell and have a sword fight or something, it would be covered. So that's a huge challenge. And in this day and age of social media and sound bites, if we don't have solid education and we don't have the kinds of historical facts and really understanding what's factual and what's not, too many people are getting their news and their knowledge in sound bites on TikTok and other Instagram and so on. And they're not getting it from the role models, and they're not going into depth, and they're not having dialogue. They don't have time. They don't have time. Don't want to talk about it. You got to do it in a sound bite. The same with training programs. Oh, they'll have a speaker on March 21st, Anti-Racism Day, or one speaker on Holocaust Education Day. Sorry, that's not enough. People have to spend the time, because otherwise, what Goebbels taught us, wins. You repeat the lies often enough with emotion and glitzy media and everything else, and people believe them, and hate wins.
The way, uh, in my opinion, and the way I think, I'll say something I haven't heard before, but I'm while listening to you, I'm thinking about it. Um, for me, 5,000 pounds of hate does not make you feel any better than 1 ounce of love. And that's the mess that we find ourselves in, that we can't understand that 1 ounce of love is worth so much more. In other words, even, when it comes to, even though, people love to drive by an accident and slow down just to see their curiosity because something bad might happen. And half the time, if something's bad happening, I've watched people who look and then regret that they looked. Don't they understand that's what teaches me that we really don't want to see terrible things, and that we enjoy watching children be born. We enjoy watching our grandparents kiss. I mean, these are all I shouldn't use the word stupid. These are all what seem to be insignificant things that we've lost the perception, not just of good, but of kind, and of gestures that are positive as opposed to ones that are negative. We're concentrating so much on the negative, we're losing track of the fact that having a moment talking to you and understanding. I'll give you an example. Yesterday we did a lacrosse show, okay, and the young girl comes from a reservation uh, near Niagara Falls in New York, and we're trying to talk about lacrosse, and we end up talking about being in the res, what it means, the terrible stuff that they've been through, that a person goes through in the res. And I'm there listening, and I'm wondering to myself, what can I do to help her? That's the toughest part. The small kindnesses are easy, yet we don't do those. I can't imagine how hard it is for someone in that position, or a black person. One of the sayings that black people use, that my friends and people I've heard, they say, they get arrested for driving while black. That term means a lot. It's a big visual. It's so easy for us to feel pain, but how do we teach people to understand and hear other people's pain? Because you've alluded to that people have to really listen. You know, please do.
Well, there's nothing that can replace personal firsthand experience. People can hear that there is such a thing as driving while black and what happens, but a good example will be when our good friends, we were up with our good friends and who happened to be black, and their teenage son wanted to borrow the car, and he was giving the keys. The dad was giving the keys, and he gave the whole spiel. Now remember, both hands on the wheel. If you get pulled over, no sarcasm. Gave all the details. And of course, I had heard this many times. My husband hadn't. And to live that experience of our kids being the same age and not having to give them that drill before they go out. And my husband remembers, he said to the young man, he said, "Have you ever been stopped?" And he says, "Yes, many times. Because when I'm driving this car and I'm black and it's a BMW, I get pulled over all the time." Well, our son didn't get pulled over when he was learning to drive. So it's real. And people don't know that unless they have a lived experience. And the idea is, and I know people want to help, but help isn't patronizing. It can't be patronizing. As many of the Indigenous people have said, and Aboriginal people, nothing about us without us. So people who have been oppressed, who are oppressed, they know what they need. And it's ensuring that in this country of all countries, people have access to the resources that they need, and that the people that they deal with are trained to recognize the systemic racism within the institution, or the kind of sense of entitlement that when we live in a country and we're white, even if we're a member of a minority, if we're white, we have something called white privilege, and it's real, and we didn't earn that. But if people don't have a sense of what it really is like to walk in the other's shoes, and by the way, that is something that's part of almost all of our cultural upbringing.
That's the complication of
Yeah,
being Canadian.
yeah,
That is, especially, we both grew up in Toronto,
yeah.
and
The indigenous people have a saying, never judge a person until you've walked a mile in his moccasins. Well, I always called that a native expression or an aboriginal expression until I was doing a training program and I gave that expression, and the next day a Jewish person who was in the audience brought me Pirkei Avot, which is the ethics of our fathers. We don't have a book yet called The Ethics of Our Mothers, but maybe that's coming. But in the ethics of our fathers, in the words of the great Hebrew sage Hillel, it says, separate not thyself from thy community and judge not another person until you have been in their place. So that's what this work is about. That's how empathy is developed. And again, at the risk of being repetitive, it isn't enough because we need the empathy, we need the relationships, we need the partnership, we need the firsthand experience, but we also need the laws and the strengthening of the laws and the protection of the laws. And not, by the way, some of the systemic racism and bias that's even in those institutions. We've got to be honest about that. And we need the education. So we
you know,
need it all.
you know, it's. I'm sorry. When I get nervous, I kind of laugh because it's just so infuriating. It's either that or I'm going to show an angry look, and I don't want to have an angry look, so I try to replace it with a laugh or a chuckle or a smile. The other issue, we're quickly running out of time. The other issue is there also is, in my opinion, because we all mean so well. We have that subject that some people, they hijack. Like, I have black friends. I understand completely what they need. I have Jewish friends. I understand completely what they need. What you said at the beginning is very important, and that is we have to listen to them. We shouldn't assume we understand. So I'm going to go on a side that a lot of people won't like. I'm one of those people that doesn't like the phrase defund the police. The reason I don't like it is for the same reason that you mentioned, because mutual respect means a lot to me. It is the same. It is the same thing that went in reverse. By virtue of saying that, you're saying all the police are bad, and they're not all bad. Don't we have to also? Doesn't human rights also need to be a listener as well and be aware of what they're saying? Because again, I bring those two words back into play: mutual respect. Somehow we can't try to rectify a situation by being as bad as the situation that we're trying to change. In other words, racism can't be erased if we're racists and if we behave racially. And we can't complain about somebody who's doing a group doing something bad and then do something bad to that group. I'm very sensitive to that term because I don't like anger words, and race and human rights I don't think has any room for words that are based on anger.
Well, again, any of these mantras, anybody that, they make it like a win
Yes.
lose, a win lose, the look at how do they say it? I mean, there are some people who used to say, well, it's not about all police, it's just about the bad apples
Right.
in the barrel. Well, and then others would say it's not just the bad apples, the whole barrel itself is what's creating the rotting. So sure, there's metaphors, sure, there's analogies, but the reality is there needs to be a real examination and an acceptance and an understanding of what the systemic barriers are to racism and to the systemic racist barriers or the systemic anti-religious barriers. And there's a reluctance for people to put themselves in a situation to understand that kind of learning. So, no, I don't like the mantra, defund the police. Where would we be if we didn't have a police service? Well, some people feel they'd be better off. Other people feel, and I'm one of these, that there'd be chaos in society, and then there'd be survival of the fittest, and we would end up, but we're better than that. We have to be better than that. There are some outstanding programs in policing that help people understand about hate crime and how they do the training. What happens, however, is when these things are used as political footballs and you get the extreme right jargon and they clamp down further and then they blame immigrants, or they, in difficult economic times, there's no identifiable minority that is safe. Anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Black, anti-Asian, you name it. And I'm sorry, that to me is anti-Canadian. So the politicians often create some of these issues by taking those kinds of sides and aiding and abetting one side or the other. Well, just a minute. How is it then that we all benefit from that? All of the good features, and they cut off the funding to the research, and in the previous federal administration, whole units were gone. The units in race relations and policing dismantled. Eliminate employment equity, or why did we create in education the Enhancing Social Justice Education group, which, by the way, I encourage you to interview one of the people from that. Why? It's because there was competition. Instead of protection, prevention, and partnership, competition and contention about whose victimization should we talk about now. And an entire sector of education and teacher education eliminated antisemitism and Holocaust studies from the equity and social justice curriculum. Well, why would that happen? It's because political agendas take over. Or why would it happen that the people who are centrally located in school boards to help people deal with racism or deal with any of the isms or phobias are sent back into the classroom because the funding is cut off? We can't do that. It's because they never made the systemic change in the first place. So I encourage you to interview the young leadership in JSpace Canada to see what direction they're taking the progressive Zionist voice that wants human rights and dignity and social justice for everyone in the region. And speak to the people in education and in policing who are still trying to do this important work in spite of the fact that politicians often make it difficult to do it because they polarize. And with the trucking thing, with all of that we're experiencing right now, you're seeing that happen because they're trying to garner votes. And God forbid, when I think of what's going on in the United States today, and when I think that these influences are coming to Canada and making it harder and harder and harder for those of us who really do want social justice and real justice for everyone, maybe we need to pray and we need to hope, but I want to see all those prayers and all those hopes and all those words put into action where we really do practice what we preach. We don't have a country that believes in equality and social justice and human rights for everyone unless we actually marginalize those voices that are trying to divide us by those mantras. Because our work is supposed to be about shared power. It's not about one group that's louder defunding or eliminating or whatever the other group. It's about how do you strengthen everyone so that every child has a right to succeed.
Now, the other thing that, again, I'm trying to open. I try. Sometimes I'm overly, sometimes, and I don't mind being that way. So, here's another one: critical race theory. Um, we all think we know what it's all about. We all think what's going on, and I'm just going to say this part, and please speak to the other side. I'm going to speak to the side where families, parents don't want their children, white children, to learn about critical race theory because they feel, and I think it's justified, they feel that they're going to be, their children are going to be stigmatized. If I can be the devil's advocate here, is there not any truth in that, that children could be stigmatized if they're told that they are the abusive people, and black kids are always going to be oppressed? Is there, in your opinion, a human rights problem that could develop from that kind of situation, or is there an age group that would be more understanding and would be able to negotiate within their own minds how to use that information?
Well, again, you're speaking to somebody right now who objects in general when any one theory or one, you know, what is it
Belief
they call it?
system.
They call it flavor of the month,
Ah,
right?
okay.
You know, and when somebody only loms on to one particular theory and drums that through and doesn't look at the whole picture, because there are different approaches that are appropriate in different situations. People used to wonder, they, as a psychologist, well, when you're teaching, are you a cognitive developmental psychologist, or are you a Skinnerian, reinforcement, behaviorist, or are you a humanist? And you had to pick only one. And I said, wait. I want educators and I want parents and I want anyone who's in a leadership position or teaching teachers to understand all of that. So, teaching children about what is racism and recognizing it all its forms isn't just lomming onto one theoretical framework and turning around and calling everybody else white supremacists, colonial oppressors, because one label doesn't fit. So there is definitely a place for critical race theory, but there is also a place for humanistic, empathetic theory. And there is also a place for understanding human rights legislation. And there's also a place for social justice education. And there's also a place for all of those theories.
Absolutely. I guess the reason I bring that up is because for me, again, it's mutual respect. You notice that I'm not mentioning mutual respect for, I'm Italian, so I'll say Italians. Mutual respect for Italians. No. You see, this is where I have the problem with the way politics works in some groups. I think the easiest solution, maybe I'm oversimplifying, is that rather than we talk about the bad, that our children should learn about, like, we have constitutions, and what do those constitutions say? They're inalienable rights, whether it's an American constitution or a Canadian constitution. Maybe what they should do is teach all our children to look around in the classroom and look at their fellow classmates and say we're all equal, as opposed to talking about the negative. Enhance the positive. I don't understand it, that's all. Am I crazy, or?
I keep getting a note saying that we've got only 2 minutes left. Is that
Yes.
the case?
Yeah, so I'm asking, you can't get that all in 2 minutes? I'm so sorry. There's so much I wanted to
You
ask
know
you.
what? In this country, Canada, I want everyone to have proper citizenship education. They need to know about our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and what it said. They need to have history. When they tried to eliminate history from the curriculum, the politicians said, oh, it's only the history teachers that are upset about it. No, Santayana taught us if you don't know history, you're bound to repeat it. Every Canadian needs to know the history of what happened in this country to Aboriginal, First Nations, Indigenous people. There can never be denial in that. And we still need to have truth and reconciliation and an understanding of the reconciliation process. Everyone has to understand what our Charter of Rights and Freedoms mean, and what equality rights are, and what equity is. These are fundamental Canadian values that our research shows, by the way, well done research, that the majority of Canadians value multiculturalism and human rights legislation and as our fundamental Canadian values. But again, we need to make sure that we do practice what we preach. And whether you're Italian or Jewish or white or Black or Muslim or homosexual or Indigenous, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but I have to, if you are Canadian, we have our rights, we have our freedoms, and we want that for all. And my freedom does not mean your oppression, and vice versa. The truckers need to know that, and so do the people that are waving swastika flags and waving Confederate flags and wanting it to have a supremacy, a white supremacy, a hateful supremacy that is not what this country is all about. We want them to have their rights and freedoms, and everyone else that claims to be Canadian.
I just find it easier to, rather than list the people whose human rights we should protect, that we should automatically assume that everybody's human rights should be respected. And that's my only point, is that we get veered off the road, because once we start pointing it, I read a book once, and we have no time left, but my favorite book isn't 1984. The author George Orwell also wrote a book called Animal Farm, which I think was a statement about why Nazism proliferated. And we can get into that another day. My whole point, folks, is that what we're hearing here from an expert is about love and understanding and acknowledgement of pain. We all have pain, and we should respect each other's pain and try to understand what we can do to prevent it, because that's the most important thing, that if we listen to people's pain, maybe we can help them resolve that pain. And you'd be surprised that if you resolve someone else's pain, they might actually be willing to help resolve yours. And that's my mutual respect component that I believe in wholeheartedly. What's good for the goose deer is good for the gander. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure, Dr. Karen Rochelle Mock. I know JSpace is going to miss you. I know you're leaving it in good hands, and I'll take you up on your offer of interviewing some of the people in there. That is nothing I would want more. The space that we have here, that Eduardo Harari and I have here on Spanglish World, is about touching people in a way that they are not touched, that we think they should be touched more about. So the Jew behind the camera and the Italian in front of the camera understand multiculturalism, respect it, and love it. And thank you for being an important part for making that more progressive, which isn't really a bad word, even though some people would like to suggest that. Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, that ends another show. This one, we could do another hour for Dr. Mock. I'm Frank Stanishi. Thank you for listening to Open and watching Open Forum, seen live Fridays at 4 p.m. The show can also be heard on the Spanglish World Radio Network, and also it's repeated repeatedly on Open Forum. Other news, entertainment, and sports programming we offer. Please check out spanglishworld.ca. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, and live it. Thank you for watching. Until next week, I'm Candid Frank. I think I'm going to have to get Windows 11, which means a new computer. Thanks, Eduardo.